What if I told you that the secret to the most resilient, flavor-packed tomatoes in the world is to completely ignore them? Yes, you heard me right. Today we are exploring the wild and chaotic world of abandoned tomatoes. We spend so much time pruning, watering, and stressing over our garden beds. But what actually happens when you just walk away and let the plants fend for themselves? You are about to discover a shocking truth that completely contradicts everything traditional gardening books tell you. By the end of this video, you will see a side of nature that might just make you throw away your pruning shears forever. So, are you a strict garden micromanager, or do you prefer to let nature take the wheel? Let me know in the comments right now, and let us dive into the wilderness. To truly understand what happens when a tomato goes wild, we have to look back at its roots. Long before we had perfectly round, shiny red fruits lined up in the supermarket, tomatoes were wild, sprawling vines native to the Andes Mountains in South America. They were essentially weeds, surviving in harsh conditions without any human intervention whatsoever. The ancient Aztecs were among the first to domesticate them, but even then, these plants retained a fierce, untamed genetic memory. For centuries, tomatoes knew exactly how to survive droughts, pests, and competing plants. It is only in the last few hundred years that humans have bred them to be fragile, dependent on our constant care and attention. So, when we abandon a modern tomato plant, we are not just leaving it to die. We are forcing it to remember its ancient, wild ancestry. Let us start with the initial phase of abandonment. It usually begins with a busy schedule or a vacation. You miss a few days of pruning, the watering system breaks, and suddenly you just decide to let it go. The immediate assumption, and a very popular gardening myth, is that without our constant care, the plant will wither and die within a week. But that is simply not true. Instead of giving up, the tomato plant shifts into survival mode. Without you pinching off the suckers, the plant begins to push out new branches in every possible direction. It transforms from an organized, single vine into a chaotic, multi-stemmed bush. Imagine a green explosion happening right in your backyard. The plant realizes that no one is coming to save it, so it rapidly expands its foliage to capture as much sunlight as humanly possible, preparing for a wild fight for survival. Now let us talk about the watering situation, because this is where things get truly fascinating. When you water a plant every single day, its roots get lazy. They stay right near the surface of the soil because they know a fresh drink is always coming. But when you abandon the plant, the surface soil dries up entirely. The tomato is forced to send its taproots deep down into the earth, searching for hidden moisture and underground aquifers. Picture a massive invisible web stretching feet below the surface. This deep-rooting system makes the feral tomato incredibly drought-resistant. It taps into minerals and nutrients that pampered, surface-level plants never even reach. So while your neatly watered garden might wilt on a hot day, the abandoned wild tomato stands tall, pulling ancient moisture from deep within the ground. As the weeks go by without any pruning, the physical structure of the plant completely changes. Traditional gardeners will tell you that a tomato plant needs strong airflow to prevent disease. We have all been taught to aggressively cut away leaves, but an abandoned tomato plant ignores this rule completely. It grows a dense, thick canopy of leaves that creates a microclimate underneath. Yes, the center of the bush gets a little humid, but this outer shell of thick foliage actually protects the delicate inner stems from scorching sun and harsh winds. It is a natural armor. Think of it like a wild thicket in a forest. This dense growth also shades the root zone, acting as a living mulch that prevents the little water it does have from evaporating. The plant sacrifices some airflow to build a fortress against the harsh outside world. What about the physical support? Without you tying the stems to a stake or a cage, the heavy, sprawling branches eventually succumb to gravity. The plant collapses onto the ground. Most people see a fallen plant and think it is ruined. But here is the brilliant part of a tomato plant's biology. Wherever the stem touches the bare soil, it sprouts brand new roots. The tiny little hairs you see on a tomato stem are actually adventitious roots, just waiting for a chance to grab onto the earth. The fallen plant transforms from an upright bush into a creeping vine. It crawls across the garden bed, anchoring itself in multiple places. This means that even if the main root system gets damaged, the plant has created backup life support systems all along its stem. It is an incredible display of natural engineering. Let us address the fruit itself, because this is where the biggest transformation occurs. When a plant is wild and unpruned, it produces hundreds of flowers instead of just a few. But because it has limited resources and no human fertilizer, it cannot grow massive, heavy tomatoes. Instead, it directs its energy into producing a massive quantity of much smaller fruits. If you abandoned a large beefsteak tomato, the resulting fruits will often be half the size you expect. But if you abandoned a cherry tomato, it reverts almost completely to its wild state. You will see enormous clusters of tiny, tough-skinned tomatoes. A great visual illustration of this is looking at wild berries in the forest. Nature prefers abundance and small size over single, massive fruits. The plant wants to create as many seeds as possible to guarantee the survival of the next generation. Now we have to talk about the flavor. This is the absolute best part of the wild tomato experiment. Supermarket tomatoes are large, watery, and often taste like absolutely nothing. Even well-watered garden tomatoes can sometimes lack punch. But an abandoned tomato? It is a concentrated flavor bomb. Because the plant has been deprived of excess water, the sugars and acids inside the fruit become highly concentrated. There is less water to dilute the natural chemistry of the tomato. When you bite into one of these feral, neglected little tomatoes, the taste is intense, sharp, and incredibly sweet. It is the true, unadulterated flavor of the ancient fruit. It completely shatters the myth that plants need constant chemical feeding to produce delicious food. Hardship and struggle actually create the most incredible culinary profiles. As the wild tomato sprawls across the ground, it inevitably runs into the ultimate garden enemy: weeds. We spend hours pulling weeds, but the abandoned tomato learns to live with them. In fact, a chaotic symbiosis begins to form. Tall weeds provide dappled shade during the most blistering days of summer, preventing sun scald on the tomato fruits. Ground cover weeds trap morning dew, adding tiny bits of moisture to the immediate area. The garden becomes a jungle, a chaotic mix of vines and native plants tangled together. While it might look like a total nightmare to a professional landscaper, to the local ecosystem, it is a paradise. The tomato plant weaves itself through the weeds, using their stiff stems as natural trellises to lift its fruit slightly off the damp soil. It is cooperative survival. With this wild jungle comes an entirely new insect ecosystem. In a manicured garden, the arrival of aphids is a disaster that has us reaching for the pesticide. But in the abandoned tomato patch, nature balances the scales. The thick, diverse plant life attracts predatory insects. For every colony of pests that arrives to eat the tomato leaves, an army of ladybugs, lacewings, and parasitic wasps moves in shortly after. Picture a miniature, high-stakes battle happening right beneath the leaves. Because you are not interfering with chemicals, the predators have a chance to establish a permanent home. The plant might suffer a few chewed-up leaves, but it rarely dies from infestation. It relies on the local insect army to keep the bad guys in check, proving that an untouched environment can regulate itself. Of course, not every tomato variety survives the wild experiment. There is a brutal process of natural selection at play here. Modern, highly engineered hybrid tomatoes usually struggle the most. They have been bred for size and transportability, completely losing their survival instincts. If you abandon a fancy greenhouse variety, it might just wither away to nothing. But if you abandon an old heirloom variety, especially a small fruited one, it thrives. These heirlooms still hold the genetic codes of their wild ancestors. They know how to fight off blight, how to scavenge for nutrients, and how to survive a cold night. Watching an heirloom outcompete a modern hybrid in a neglected garden is a perfect illustration of how much resilience we have accidentally bred out of our modern food supply. As autumn approaches, the life cycle of the feral tomato reaches its most crucial stage. The unpicked fruits ripen until they are almost bursting. Without human hands to harvest them, they simply drop to the ground. They fall into the tangled mess of weeds and rotting leaves. This looks like a tragic waste of good food, but for the plant, this is the ultimate goal. The rotting fruit acts as a natural compost, feeding the soil directly around the seeds. The slimy gel inside the tomato prevents the seeds from germinating too early in the cold weather. It is a perfectly timed, self-contained survival pod. The plant is literally planting its own children in a bed of custom-made fertilizer, preparing for a future it will not live to see. Then comes the freezing winter. The main tomato plant, being a tropical vine at heart, cannot survive the frost. The sprawling green vines turn black, wither, and collapse into the soil. To a human observer, the experiment appears to be over. The garden is just a patch of dead, frozen brown sticks. But beneath the frost, under the snow and the dead leaves, hundreds of tiny seeds are sleeping. They are enduring freezing temperatures that would destroy most tropical plants. This winter dormancy is a severe test. Only the strongest, most resilient seeds will survive the freezing and thawing cycles of the soil. Nature is actively filtering out the weak genetics, ensuring that next year's plants will be even tougher than the last. When spring finally arrives and the soil warms up, a miracle happens. You do not need to start seeds indoors under expensive grow lights. You do not need to harden them off or carefully transplant them. Right out of the decaying mess of last year's garden, tiny green shoots begin to emerge. These are called volunteer tomatoes. They pop up in the most unlikely places. You will find them growing out of cracks in the driveway, in the middle of the lawn, or right out of the compost pile. Picture a tough little seedling pushing its way through a solid rock path. These feral volunteers are incredibly aggressive growers. Because they germinated in the natural outdoor conditions, they are perfectly acclimated to the local weather from day one. These volunteer plants are fundamentally different from the pampered seedlings you buy at a nursery. They are the survivors of the winter purge. They have incredibly thick, sturdy stems that can withstand heavy spring winds without breaking. They are highly resistant to the local fungal spores in the soil because they were born directly into it. If you try to dig one up and move it, you will notice that its root system is already twice as deep as a greenhouse plant of the same size. Many gardeners consider these volunteers to be a nuisance and pull them like weeds. But if you leave them alone, they will often outgrow, outproduce, and outlast any tomato plant you intentionally put in the ground. Let us talk about the concept of lazy gardening and the time you save by letting things go wild. The average gardener spends hours every week tying up branches, pinching off tiny leaves, mixing fertilizers, and fretting over every yellow spot. When you embrace the wild tomato method, you get hundreds of hours of your life back. The mental shift is profound. You stop viewing the garden as a fragile machine that will break without your constant labor, and start seeing it as a self-sustaining ecosystem. The stress of having a perfect-looking vegetable bed completely disappears. You realize that you do not need to be a helicopter parent to your plants. Sometimes doing absolutely nothing is the most advanced gardening technique you can master. There is a massive misconception about the yield of a wild plant. People think that if you do not prune, you will get less food. But let us look at the actual math of the biomass. A strictly pruned single-stem tomato plant might give you 20 perfectly large slicing tomatoes over a season. A completely feral, unpruned bush might give you 400 tiny cherry-sized tomatoes. When you put them on a scale, the total weight of the wild harvest often equals or exceeds the manicured plant. You are getting the exact same amount of calories and nutrition, just distributed into smaller, more numerous packages. The wild plant maximizes its output based on its environment, proving that nature is incredibly efficient when left to its own devices. One of the most surprising benefits of the abandoned tomato is its disease resistance later in the season. We are taught that messy plants catch the dreaded late blight immediately. But wild plants have a secret weapon. Because they sprawl across the ground and root in multiple places, they can afford to lose whole sections of their vines. If one branch gets infected and dies off, the plant simply shifts its energy to a healthy branch rooted 3 feet away. It can sacrifice parts of itself to save the whole. A pruned single-stem plant has no backup plan. If the main stem gets sick, the entire plant dies. The wild tomato's chaotic structure is actually a highly evolved risk management system. The visual aesthetic of a wild tomato patch is something you have to learn to appreciate. It is not neat. It is not tidy. It looks like a riot of green chaos. But there is a deep, primal beauty in it. When you look closely, you see a thriving community of spiders spinning webs between the branches, bees buzzing aggressively around the thousands of tiny yellow flowers, and birds using the dense cover to hide from predators. It stops being just a place to grow food and becomes a miniature wildlife sanctuary. This wild aesthetic challenges our modern desire to control and organize nature into straight lines and perfect grids. It reminds us that real life is messy, tangled, and wild. Harvesting from a wild tomato plant is completely different from picking a normal garden. It is like going on a treasure hunt. You have to lift up heavy vines, reach deep into the tangled center of the bush, and carefully avoid the spiders. You will find hidden clusters of ruby-red fruits resting right on the earth, perfectly ripe and warm from the sun. Because the fruits are smaller, you end up snacking on them right there in the yard. It connects you to the hunter-gatherer experience. You are not just harvesting a crop, you are foraging for food in your own backyard. This makes the experience of eating them feel incredibly rewarding and deeply connected to the natural world. By allowing a tomato to go wild, we are actually participating in a hyper-local breeding program. Over 3 or 4 years of abandoning the same patch of dirt, something magical happens. The seeds that drop and survive are adapting specifically to your exact microclimate. They are learning the specific soil chemistry of your yard, the exact rainfall patterns of your city, and the unique pests that live in your neighborhood. You are creating a brand new, ultra-resilient variety of tomato that belongs exclusively to your backyard. No scientist in a lab could breed a plant better suited to your specific home than nature does through the simple process of abandonment and survival of the fittest. Ultimately, the experiment of the wild tomato teaches us a profound lesson about life and control. We spend so much energy trying to optimize, manage, and protect things, convinced that without us, everything will fall apart. But the humble tomato plant proves that life is incredibly stubborn. Given half a chance, life will find a way to adapt, spread, and flourish in the most difficult circumstances. The wild tomato does not need us. It tolerates us. When we step back and let go of our need for control, we are rewarded with fierce resilience, unbelievable flavor, and a fascinating display of natural power. It changes the way you look at a simple vegetable forever. And there you have it, the incredible, chaotic, and beautiful truth about what happens when you completely abandon your tomato plants. We have seen how a pampered garden vegetable can tap into its ancient, wild instincts, transforming into a deep-rooting, drought-resistant survivor. We discovered that stepping away from the pruning shears leads to concentrated flavor bombs, natural pest control, and a localized ecosystem that manages itself perfectly. The biggest plot twist is that our constant micromanagement might actually be holding our plants back from their true, resilient potential. Nature really does know best. Thank you so much for watching and going on this wild garden adventure with me. If this video changed how you think about gardening, please hit that subscribe button and leave a like. Now, I want to hear from you. Are you going to let a corner of your garden go completely wild this year? Or are you too attached to your neatly pruned rows? Let us debate it down in the comments.